All right, welcome to office hours for service APIs. It is August 26th. We are just running through all these different things at this point. I think some of these things may make sense as a follow-up tomorrow as part of the regular meeting as well. But because we're here, I wanted to really spend as much time as possible digging through V1 Alpha 1 release checklist. I think we're really close. I wanted to check in with everyone on what they think is required to get this, what everyone thinks is required to get this into V1 Alpha 1 final state. I think, Harry, this SNI matching and mode PR is required for TLS config. Do you think TLS route is?
I mean, TLS route is probably not in part for that proposal, but in general, we had sort of an unwritten agreement that we want TLS routing to be part of even Alpha 1. We have find ways going with this.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't had a great chance to, what is unique? Well, I guess we'll get to that in PR and issue triage. I don't want to hold that up too much. Other than these two PRs, do you think there's anything else needed on the TLS front?
Yeah, so there's TLS and route.
Yeah.
And so I started with that, but then ran into another issue. So I opened the PR for TLS route. TLS and route, I can push that later this week. That's a little controversial at this point, but I think that would be something we need to decide, like our stand on it.
Okay, so and just so I understand the difference between so TLS on gateway is for termination or pass through. TLS, if we associate it with a backend, is fairly clear for the upstream connection. TLS on route, remind me the purpose there.
Yeah, so in some cases, the service owners who control the X route resources, they want to configure the TLS, and we want to let them configure the certificate in the route. So
okay, that's all it is. Okay, so it's basically it serves the same functionality as TLS config on gateway. It just happens to be.
Yes, it's more. Yeah, but it's more restricted. So
right.
gateway is something that allows you to do a lot more, and TLS and route is like very, very restrictive, but it does allow you, just the certificate setting.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. That makes sense. So it is an extension of TLS config on gateway and would override any settings that existed at the gateway listener level for TLS config.
Correct. If the gateway allows for that, or rather if the listener allows for that.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So Harry, I think I made a comment about something about this in the PR, and I think that's kind of the explanation that we need to give people, because when we have multiple ways of doing what seem to be similar things, then I think we just need to feel like we need to kind of give people some sort of guidance about how they should think about this.
I see. So which comment are you referring to in this case?
There was a comment about that might be easy to link to it. I say you can match on the SNI server name at the listener and use a TCP route. So,
I see what you're saying.
So how do users know, how should users think about when they should use a TCP route and when they should use a TLS route?
I see.
Yeah. So I think that's the guidance. I think you look at the spec and you go, what is this thing for? And there's like different ways to accomplish very, very similar things. So I think kind of explaining that the way you just explained is.
So I thought we're removing the SNI route from the TCP route, and that would resolve that ambiguity.
So we did, and so, but I have added a PR for TLS route specifically. So TLS route and TCP route are two separate things.
But there's also SNI dependencies at the listener. Right?
Yeah, I totally get your point.
So that's what yeah. So for Bowie,
Oh, I see. Got it.
so that the ambiguity here is you have SNI dependencies at the listener, and you have SNI dependencies for the TLS route. So what are they kind of giving some kind of guidance around the use cases for these different things? I think
So
helps
that
people.
makes total sense. Yes, I completely agree there. What is a good place to document that though?
In
I
the
think that
source
needs to
code,
happen
maybe like
at
at the. Go ahead, Bowie.
we were actually saying exactly the same words, at the listener, and then at SNI route probably, or TLS route.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe a block comment at the start of TLS route, or also in the website, one of the website documents. It's unfortunate. I don't think block comments at the top of this TLS route types file will actually make it through into the API rendered API docs.
Yeah, they don't. So I'll try to put them in listener and TLS route, just the spec docs, and then we'll take it from there. It also, like, we also need documentation on how to use the API as well in the website itself. More on that later, I guess.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that would make sense in that context, I think.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Mark had been working on some kind of demo or documentation that was more user-friendly for these APIs. But yeah, we definitely need something be as part of an alpha release. Yeah, great. Okay, and maybe, well, since we've already opened the can of worms of TLS route, Harry, is there anything more you wanted to cover on this PR?
No, I think so. We decided to like, we had a PR, I think, by Jeremy, to add TLS and TCP route, and that seemed kind of weird. So we decided we'll go for SNI route, and decided to call it TLS route because all the other routes are named based on protocol and not a field name. So that's why this is TLS route, and it only has SNI routing. The support is core. We can definitely debate on it and discuss and finalize on that. Other than that, there is nothing very special about this route. It tries to mirror other routes as closely as possible. James has had some good feedback on it, so that needs some discussion.
Harry, do you think that TLS route would be the right place to specify the ALPN as well?
Yeah, I think that's like one of the reasons to have TLS route, where on the listener level, you specify, okay, this port is going to do TLS termination, and right, and then do things like ALPN routing would be inside the TLS route instead of at the listener level, right? And then in some cases it would also mean that you could also use TLS at the listener level to filter the SNIs. So maybe the gateway owners decide which SNIs they really want to filter out, and that could be, like, sort of subdomains on a specific list of domains. Or if the gateway owner trusts the service owners, then it would be like match domain any. ALPN is not part of the matching right now in this spec, but yeah, I do agree that it would be ALPN. But then we cannot have HTTP based, like, ALPN. So things like HTTP2 upgrade, which can be done based on ALPN, probably don't belong here, because at that point, then, I mean, you could, if someone wants to do it, someone can do it, but they cannot then take advantage of HTTP routing at that point.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think I was imagining ALPN would go in the match clause.
Yep, that makes sense. Yes.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for filing this PR. I'll take a look afterwards. It does look pretty straightforward. Great. Okay, so that is TLS config. Harry, this is the only thing left that isn't currently a PR, just adding TLS config to route?
Yeah, I think so. That's all the
Okay.
part of the proposal. Yeah.
Okay, great. For advanced routing, I think we're really close. If I'm understanding this correctly, your HTTP route filter PR, I think you were ready to move on with it. It's not necessarily that it's final, just that it's ready for more iteration in follow-up PRs. Is that the state?
Yeah, so it's been like a couple of weeks. You've had some feedback and some corrections, but I think we are at the point of diminishing returns at this point.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to merge it if there are no major issues in this PR, and then iterate if necessary.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the main thing that this adds is it pluralizes filter, and it adds header matching. Header modification at this.
Yes, the header modifications
stage.
were already part of this. I just did some just rearrangement to make sure it fits the filter use case. Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have any kind of hesitancy towards getting this one in?
No, I think let's get it reviewed. I will take a look. I think there's still some questions about should we name it action or filter, but that could be a follow-on. I don't want to just like block everything on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there's an issue somewhere that you've linked to. Yeah. Okay, great.
In part of that proposal, boy, we need one more thing to get in, which is traffic mirroring. That was sort of part of the proposal, and we before decided that mirroring would be a filter. So I did open a PR for that yesterday. I think maybe 2 days.
Okay, is it dependent? Can you, anyways, ping me on Slack with the specific dependency is it going to have conflicts when it merges?
Yeah, it will. So it includes the commit from the HTTP route filter PR, and so once we merge that, we'll have to rebase that and merge this.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, request mirror, and I think we'll talk more. Well, no, yeah, that's good. We can bring that up more in triage. But as far as advanced routing, are those the only things left to get in?
I believe so. Daniel, do you have anything else that we need to cover in that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. That should be it.
Okay, so the next one, this previously said service level config. I just reworked it a bit. I wanted to bring up backend policy. I've been thinking about it a lot over the past week. I initially had this proposal that we discussed briefly in the past couple meetings about how we could do service level configuration. And I think there is a real need for service level config. What is less clear is what belongs there and what belongs on route. I think it's fairly obvious that TLS config being linked to a specific backend makes sense for the upstream. I think other things that make sense there pretty clearly would be, say, health checking. What I am increasingly less sure about would be the timeout policy, and especially the retry policy. Retry policy feels like it really could belong on route. Timeout policy maybe could belong on route, and both of these line up with PR that Danian already has, adding both retry and timeout there. So I wanted to discuss just briefly, like, what makes sense to be tied specifically to a service, and what do we want to have tied at a route level. I think service level config is a very valuable and important concept that we need to have in V1 Alpha 1 in some capacity. We want to model a way to provide configuration per backend that isn't just on a route. I think that's an important concept. But I, at this point, am not as sure about both timeouts and retries. So I'm actually thinking about pulling both of them from this PR to be addressed at a later point and or potentially be considered on route. Does that general idea make sense here? So at its core, this would for sure contain TLS config and maybe additional things.
So Rob, why do you feel that way? Why do you feel that like TLS config does fit nicely into a backend policy, but not timeouts, retries?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So timeout policy is, I can see either place there. I know lots of implementations have timeout policy in either place. The retry policy is especially interesting in that different routes may want to specify different retry policies for the same backend. At least that was my theory on this one. And retry policy also feels like something to me that there is pretty vague. There are, you know, I've done a survey of a lot of different implementations, HA Proxy, Nginx, Envoy, etc., as far as what you can configure for retries. And there's a lot of variation here. So part of my hesitancy to adding it here is not necessarily that it doesn't belong here forever. It's just, it's maybe not core. It's maybe, well, no, I shouldn't say maybe not core. It's maybe not important enough to get into V1 Alpha 1. So part of my motivation here is I am trying to push forward for a V1 Alpha 1 launch. And I want to make sure that we're not including, you know, like a retry policy as an example, something that is extended and not supported everywhere and may be hard to standardize on. So I don't want to really, you know, push out our release date on something that may not be as obvious to support. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So is the thought there then is we don't include timeouts and retry policies, and so we can move forward with the release, and then we figure out where the best home is for this functionality?
Yeah, that was my idea. I mean, it's not that I don't want these to be part of the API. I'm just not as sold that they need to be part of the first release of this API. You know, I think at least the way I see this API, we need to get the building blocks correct. We need to get, or as close as possible, we need to get the major resources route. So the idea of gateway class, gateway route, and now potentially backend policy. The idea of understanding each of those concepts, I think, is is helpful and something like that we should include. But the specifics of all the different config that we can add to, say, a backend policy, I don't think we need every option as part of the initial API.
Yeah, I agree with your perspective, and I'm in favor of leaving the timeout and retry policy out of the release, so that the release does not get stalled, and I think it's important for us to cut this release.
Yeah.
It's easier to add this later on, even if it ends up being part of a backend policy. It's easier to add it later on than to take it out. So that's my main reason for agreeing with your perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that's exactly what I was thinking. As we're getting awfully close, I'd really hope to get this out in August. I don't think we're going to do that, but I think we are awfully close, and we already have an API that's incredibly, it's implementable or very close to implementable. And I want that to be able to be used and implemented, and, we'll learn a lot from those first implementations as far as what we want to iterate and where we need to expand. Yeah,
I agree. I don't think we could figure out all the details until we actually start proceeding with implementations and iterating on the API specs.
Yeah, I did briefly consider, and this goes against everything I just said, so I will probably not do this. But one thing, if it is not too controversial, is I looked again in that survey of all the different implementations I was looking at. A basic health check is very commonly supported. Just the idea of a HTTP GET or something like that, and that does feel like something that belongs at a backend level instead of on a route level. Like, that feels like it very clearly belongs here, whereas timeouts and retries aren't quite as clear to me. I don't know if I'm going to go too much further down that, but it does feel like if we want to have a backend policy and we want to make it clear that it is for more than just TLS, that's a relatively straightforward thing to add as a very basic component. But I know it's a slippery slope there. So yeah. But I think if we're all okay with it, I'd like to start with a really, really basic backend policy design, and just more of a concept of here is how we'll attach policy config to backends, and try not to dig too far down that path of all the advanced configuration we could do there yet.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think we can have, like, it's not necessary to get everything in V1 Alpha 1, right? So
yeah,
I think that's good.
Cool. The next one that I wanted to cover was conflict handling. I think reasonably close here. I have
Rob?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but before we jump on to the next topic, one other question on the, well, maybe I'm looking at the wrong PR. I think I am, for the backend policy. One of my pieces of feedback initially was just defining what a backend is.
Yeah.
Was that? Okay.
Yes, I should do that. I should do that better in this doc. So in this PR, I had a doc, which I haven't linked to here. I linked probably in an agenda somewhere that may define it slightly better. But the idea of a backend, well, really it is primarily going to be service, but a backend represents maybe, yeah, okay. let me work on the actual vocabulary there. But a really simple explanation of my understanding of a backend is anything that can be forwarded to from a route. Maybe that's too vague, but a backend is something that is forwarded to from a route. I think is the highest level explanation of my understanding of this. Does that line up with what you were thinking?
I think that's actually pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that, right, because people could just come up with their own definitions of backends. So I just want to make sure that we make it very clear what we call a backend.
Yeah.
Define what a
Makes
backend
sense.
is.
Cool. For conflict handling, I think we're in a reasonably good place here. I have a lot of things that I have considered resolved or accepted at this point. I need to follow up. It looks like Harry may have added some feedback since I've been in here. So I will follow up with this one. I think the way to resolve a lot of these is going to be through comments on the types themselves to indicate how they should be interpreted. And then a higher level bit of documentation that documents these kinds of guiding principles for conflict resolution somewhere on the actual website, in the docs, wherever it happens to be. I think that is all that's left for conflict resolution. But anyone correct me if I'm wrong here, if there's some kind of potential conflict I have not addressed yet, or that we don't have an acceptable resolution for, definitely let me know. But I will try and make these resolutions a little bit more visible by getting them into a PR, so we can get some more feedback there as well. And on that note, I do have this one PR. We've had a lot of discussion on this. I think, okay, yeah, I'll follow up with Harry. I need to, I lost track of this, this thread. Yeah. Okay, so that's conflict handling. The very last one is James is taking care of status and conditions. And I know you've already added some awesome stuff to the agenda. So thank you, James. And it's this doc around condition vocabulary, which we'll get to shortly. And then I think, yeah, we just, well, yeah, we'll cover that as part of the agenda, but I know I've taken half our time to go through this, this roadmap. I do think we're close. I know this is not going to be an August release, but I am quite optimistic still that it's going to be soon. Yeah, so with that said, yeah, let's get into the actual agenda for today, which is a few things long. First off, I and Harry had a bit of a discussion about this PR, which would require action. And my question was, well, what is the difference? This, along with Harry's PR that would add mirroring as a filter, got me wondering, well, how do we distinguish between what is an action and what is a filter? And are we always going to have an action? These kinds of things. So I think we had a really helpful discussion on this. Though we ended up with slightly different understandings at the end of this discussion, I think. So yeah, I guess I'll cover my understanding and Harry correct me. Yeah, whatever. So basically, my understanding was that every route should require an action, like this PR would implement. And that action could be forward to, maybe at some point it would include redirects, like just URL redirects. And of course, it already includes an extension ref. But that is the one action that will happen as part of the route, and it's required as part of that match. I'd actually, there's a little bit about the potential to do HTTP to HTTPS redirects, but that feels like it's kind of outside the scope of a route. In my mind, all routes should have a single action, and a filter can be applied before or after an action can take place. And filters can perform actions on a request or response. You can have 0 to infinite filters. I don't know what kind of upper limit we'd have there. And filters could include things like request auth, modifying headers, mirroring traffic, I don't know, any kind of custom extension at that point. This was my understanding of kind of the differentiation between actions and filters, where action is kind of this primary thing, the primary purpose of that route, and filters are modifiers or verifiers or authorizers or whatever on top of that. I don't know. I think Harry, you may have had a slightly different take, so maybe you should give your understanding. Oh, Harry had to drop off. I missed that. Yes, he always has to drop off at 3:30. So anyone else have any thoughts on what an action and what a filter should be here?
I think
I think like, go ahead, James.
I was going to say, I think you've captured it pretty well. It's just that in the real world, I think you've captured it about as well as it can be captured. So, I mean, basically you have a pipeline of processing stages, and filters are steps along the pipeline, and actions kind of terminate that. And then there's a whole bunch of special cases like authorization, which is a stage, which is kind of a filter and an action in that definition. But I think you've captured it as well as it can be in a general sense.
Hey, James, would you say that filters in this sense are equivalent or at least similar to filters for Envoy?
It's a terminology that's not specific to Envoy. Like Nginx has it. I think Facebook's Proxygen has it. Like it just appears everywhere. The only
that's kind of the issue, is that it appears everywhere. So it's hard. So everyone means different things by it.
Yeah, I think that's why there's an alternate proposal to just, and this is mostly around naming, is just calling everything action and then the final action to be like terminal action or something. Mostly I see this as can we explain it to the users such that they don't get very confused? Like any solution is okay as long as it meets that requirement in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea of can this all just be a single list instead of what we have here? I guess where it gets a little bit vague is it becomes more difficult to know that to validate that you actually have a terminating action. Like if you say, okay, every route must have at least one action, and it must be one of, well, actually no, because an action can include an extension ref, which we have no idea if that's actually a terminating action. You would hope it would be.
Well, I just think it's awkward in the CRD because we don't have abstract types.
You could do it like you could say there's a specific action that's outside the list, and then there's a list of extras. Like you could conceivably do it, and then it's up to the validation, like some basic validation that you could just look at that one element. There are ways we can make it possible. That might be confusing, but it's possible.
Yeah, so in that case, you would end up with a single action type. Let's say they were all called actions, and a primary or terminating action that was defined separately from all the rest of the actions. I guess one thing about filters is we explicitly say that we are not, the order of filters as they're defined does not necessarily have any meaning in this API, whereas an action is kind of separate from that, and it is meant to be the terminating action. I don't think we've actually defined that, but that has been my interpretation. If you had everything in a single list, it would become less clear what that terminating action should be. Unless you could somehow derive it from the type of action it was.
Yeah, like you could have a singular action field, and then I don't know what you would call it, extra actions. We're clever. We can come up with something as a list. Not clear if that's like the more understandable. One interesting thing is that it is you end up with a schema that's very similar to the pluralization of a field schema, for better or for worse.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So you keep saying an action is, in a sense, a terminating item, but you also say that actions can be applied before or after an action. And I have a few questions around that, but first thing is it's kind of confusing to say an action may be terminating if a filter may take place after, or am I misinterpreting something?
Yeah, I don't think we have any kind of concrete example of a filter that would be applied on the response. And maybe to, oh yeah, that's fair. So I guess the maybe a better way to I guess you could say an action is responsible for returning a response, and filters can modify that request or response. Is that fair?
But if one of the actions is a mirror2, I thought that a mirror2 doesn't provide a response.
It's right, but Harry's current PR actually makes mirror a filter.
Okay.
Another question I had was, is whether the action is performed on, is whether a filter is performed on request or response a property of the filter? That is, do you say these are filters for pre-action and these are filters for post-action? Or do you just have filters which, if it makes sense, can be done beforehand, or if it makes sense, can be done afterhand? Right? Are there two types of filters, or is it all about how you order them with respect to the action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it would be very difficult, especially in that modify header example, to understand when that header modification should occur. I guess you could have request header modification and response header modification as two separate kinds of actions.
Or it almost feels like there should be two lists, at least two. One for pre-filter pre-action filter, maybe a list or just a singleton for the action, and then another list for the post-action filters.
Yeah, so kind of, I mean, as a dumb way of saying it, like a pre-filter, action, and post-filter, and within the pre-filter and post-filter lists, we can't guarantee ordering. We just know they're going to happen before or after an action has occurred.
That could work.
Okay.
I'm a bit hesitant to kind of make a more sophisticated model,
Yeah.
because it's harder to match that to any particular implementation. It occurs to me, one thing I just thought of is maybe drop the concept of actions altogether. And so you can model things and you can say there are filters and there is forwarding. So filters are whatever processing stages you want on the request or the response, and then you can forward.
How do you define on filters which filters happen before, which filters modify a request and which filters modify a response? You know, which filters need to be performed after the forwarding has occurred?
Well, that would just be the filter type. That's sort of,
Okay.
That's kind of the situation we're in now, right? We have
Okay.
request filters and response filters.
Okay.
We just drop you just drop the idea of actions as a concept, and you just say that here's your list of filters and here's your forwarding target.
So, okay, if you do that, then and just to clarify, forward to is still separate. It's outside of filters. Forward to is its own thing, right? In that approach.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
the forwarding.
Okay.
It's the forwarding
And
field.
you can imagine that there would be some filters that some sequence of filters where you wouldn't want to forward at all. So let's say you have a filter that is a URL redirect, as an example, if that becomes a filter. Do you then make the forwarding optional, but then also filters are optional, and so then everything is optional?
Yeah, I mean that's the reality of how proxies work, right? I mean that's the reality
Okay.
of the underlying implementations, and you go, well, the you don't have. So I think if there's an advantage to my suggestion, it's that you don't need to justify the distinction between filters and actions, right? You just say filters can do whatever, and sometimes you can forward.
I mean, this starts to feel dangerously close to the idea that everything is just an action or filter or whatever you want to call it, and forwarding is just one of those things that happens to be in there. It's all just one big list, and let's just hope you've got at least one thing in that list.
Yeah, I think forwarding is a bit special though. That's why I would still distinguish forwarding, because I think that's a substantial use case. Well, I mean, it's the 99% use case, right? You actually want your proxy to forward a request to somewhere.
Okay. I mean, the one thing I'll say is I don't mind that. It does somewhat simplify things in the sense that you have forward and you have filters for everything else, and extension ref has feels weird in action when you have filters, which are basically extensions and can do what, like, it feels like duplication. Redirect could potentially go on a filter, but sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is hard to distinguish between these two. Maybe, James, if you don't mind adding that, that comment or suggestion to this PR 273, that would be very helpful to have some follow-up discussion here.
Okay, I'll add the comment and I'll think about it for more than 5 seconds before I do.
Sounds good. All right, well, thanks for that. We have one more thing here, and this is from James. I wanted to make sure we had some time to cover it. And actually, before we could get into this, James, would you rather talk about this in tomorrow's meeting, or is now fine? I don't know what you had in mind here.
Now it's fine. I think
Okay.
I'd also like to bring it up in the official meeting for
Yeah,
visibility
yeah.
and to get feedback.
Yeah, I think
Happy
you
to
know,
go
we
through
only
it
have
now.
10 minutes left anyway, so we might as well get what we can out of this and get some initial feedback if that works for you.
Sure. So basically what I've tried to do here is look at the existing errors that we have and try and kind of organize them a bit into something that I feel reflects the categories of things that can go wrong. I haven't taken a strong stand on the polarity of the conditions. There's no resolution on polarity upstream. We're still kind of in this holding pattern where the official guidance says negative polarity, but large parts of the community are going off and doing positive polarity. So
Right.
it seems to be all about like, hey, do what makes sense for you. I do like, I know Micah has a PR which uses a positive polarity condition for the route types, and that PR makes a lot of semantic sense to me. So there's one argument we could make is that we should do positive polarity to be consistent across the API. But anyway, for here, I've given both names, and I've tried to be careful about how to choose names so that they can make sense in both positive and negative polarities. So there's an example here. You just have to kind of flip the status to make it make sense depending on whether you choose the type name to be positive or negative. So the other thing that I haven't changed is the grouping of listener conditions by port. That's, I feel, is still a bit wonky because of, primarily because of the addition of UDP. So prior to UDP, when we only had TCP and upwards protocols, then you're either collapsing stacked protocols down onto a single port or you're not. And so everything's on, so you basically end up with what happens to everything that I should have built on this port. So grouping by port makes sense. But in UDP, two things can happen. Like you can have the UDP ports, UDP port 53 is fine, but TCP port 53 is not. There's no good way to express that anymore. So for gateway, there's really only a couple of conditions at the moment. So there's pending, which is the state sometime, which is the state between creating the resource and allocating or finding some kind of underlying infrastructure to instantiate that resource on. It could be like, and so that's what we've talked about before, the concept of scheduling the gateway. So you have this period of time where the gateway is not scheduled, so it's pending. then you're basically ready. So you're either ready, once you've actually found some underlying resources to put your gateway on, then you can be ready or not. Right? So you can be ready if everything's cool, but you can be not ready. You can be ready with a status of false if the listeners aren't ready, or if there's some problem with the listeners, because that's really the only thing that a gateway has.
Just
The rest, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, one question here. You have this not reconciled condition or reason here. Is there room for some kind of intermediate state where basically a controller is working on it but has not reconciled it yet? And I recognize this is not going to take a lot of time for a lot of implementations, but I can see for some, like cloud as an example, where you're spinning up a load balancer, it could take a minute between when a controller recognizes this is something they should care about and between when they've actually reconciled it. I don't know if there's value there.
Yeah, there could be like a non. I guess some of these reasons are, I guess, terminal reasons, like no resources is like, we're done. But you can imagine there's non-terminal reasons, like you're waiting on some kind of approval process, or you're waiting for some cloud resources to become available. So that I think definitely
Right.
there's other additional reasons that implementations could put in there.
Yeah, like
And
even
we
if
might
there
want to
was a provisioning reason, or I don't know, just making things up. But yeah. Sorry to sidetrack you there.
Yeah, I think some feedback I had, I'm not sure if it's here or whether I got it out of band, is, are these the only things that we're allowed to put in? And I think the answer is no.
Got it.
I think that there's benefits to having a common vocabulary as much as possible, because I think that helps the ecosystem generally. But I don't think that this I don't think that this vocabulary here is exhaustive. And I definitely think implementations are allowed to, at their own, publish their own status kinds and reasons if it makes sense for them.
Yeah, makes sense.
The listener conditions, there's more bad things that can happen to listeners, but the high level states which we're representing here are conflicts. So listeners can be conflicted, which is like, oh, you specified 2 listeners and you can't have them both for some kind of reason. Listeners can be detached. This is like, you had a listener and I think it's fine, but I can't do it. So it's the notion that you had this request that can't actually be attached to a gateway. So the notion of like listeners and gateways are kind of connected in some way. That state is fairly similar to disconnected refs. There's a fair bit of conceptual overlap, I think, between the detached state and the disconnected refs state. So you're in the positive polarity, you've gone through this process and you've resolved all the references and you know they're good. In the negative polarity, you've gone through the process of resolving them and you've found an error and you've got, oh, some references are disconnected on this thing. So that's kind of bad, or it's partially bad. We're not quite, depending on the implementation, it could be not so bad. Dropped routes is specific to routes. So there's cases where the listener specifies the route selector, but you can detect in the controller that not everything that route selector selects is going to be good. So you're saying, well, we used some of them, but we didn't use some others. So I think this is something that could feed into the the conflict handling semantics. So for example, if you had a selector which resolved, everything was fine, and you programmed it down to the gateway, and then the selector changed and you couldn't do it anymore, then you could end up with dropped routes because you have some and now you don't have all of the ones that you wanted. And the final state is ready, which is everything's cool. So you're ready if you did all of the previous kind of processing stages. You resolved your conflicts, you attached everything, you connected, you resolved your references, and you didn't drop any routes, and you programmed the whole thing into the listeners, then you're ready and it's good, and you're good to go.
This is awesome. Thank you so much for getting this all together, and especially for me as someone who was trying to figure out conflict resolution, this will help a ton on that front as well. So thank you for the contributions on that front as well. I think there's going to be some overlap in conditions I suggested and what you already have here proposed here. So this is
this looks great.
Awesome. I will make a note to read through this again and leave any feedback I can think of between now and tomorrow's meeting.
Cool, thanks. So I think there's probably a lot of implementation specific stuff we can add here, or like as people think of new cases, we can add more reasons or even conditions. I've generally tried to create the condition types so that they're orthogonal. So I believe that one of the goals for conditions is that a controller would always publish a status for all the possible conditions. So in listener conditions, for example, by default, you'll get 1, 2, 3, 4. You would get 5 entries in your condition array, like just permanently.
Got it. So even if they were a negative condition, you would have a negative value, and like, okay.
Yeah, so if you're not conflicted, so if you are conflicted, you would say I am conflicted, and then the conflict and my conflicted state is true. But if you're not conflicted, you would say my conflicted state is false.
Got it. Okay.
So you would always be able to tell. So I think the idea there is that you try and avoid the potential ambiguity of what does it mean if the controller didn't tell me about their condition? Do I assume it's unknown, or do I assume it's good or bad?
That makes sense. Okay. Well, yeah, I know we're at time, but this is really great. I will read through this some more. Thank you so much for the overview, and we'll talk to everyone tomorrow.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.